Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller.
As Ayaan Hirsi Ali advised us in episode 119, you must know your enemy. Therefore, we must learn about the global movement of Islamists or radical Muslims, to which Hamas and other organizations in the world belong. What do they want? What drives them? And how do they operate? In this episode, we will make a start with answering these questions. Robert Spencer is the director of the online publication Jihad Watch and a Shulman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He's the author of 27 books, including the bestsellers The Palestinian Delusion, The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS, and The Critical Quran, explained from key Islamic commentaries and contemporary historical research. He has led seminars on the doctrine of jihad, or Islamic Holy War, for the FBI, the United States Central Command, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the US intelligence community, and other national security bodies in and outside the United States. He has published and commented in many media around the world. Robert, we're honored and thrilled to have you on our show. Welcome.
Thank you. The honor is all mine.
Thank you. Robert, what is the common goal of Islamists or radical Muslims, and what inspires them towards that goal?
Well, in the first place, what inspires them is the holy book of Islam, the Quran, and the words and example of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, who teach that it is part of the responsibility of Muslims worldwide to wage war against unbelievers in order to establish the hegemony of Islamic law over the whole world. The whole reason for jihad violence of whatever form, whether it's someone stabbing people on the street at random or blowing up a building or the massacre that we saw in Israel on October 7th, the goal is always the same: to destabilize non-Muslim authorities and even Muslim authorities that are not governing according to Islamic law, so that ultimately any government that is not based on Islamic law will fall and be replaced by a government that is based on Islamic law. That's what the whole thing is about. And then Islamic law mandates a second-class status for the non-Muslims, and this is why there is resistance to this imperative around the world.
So, yeah, go ahead, Phyllis.
I just wanted to ask a clarification. You know, in Judaism, over 2,000 years and more, we've had rabbis who have revised the law. I was just reading something recently, and am I correct in that radicalism has not been revised out of the Quran by religious leaders in the Muslim religion? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, you're quite right. In Judaism, at the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, there was a massive reevaluation of the entire religion. That was, of course, the impetus for the creation of Talmudic Judaism, which is not based on the temple worship. There's never been anything like that in Islam. In Islam, the idea of the Quran as the perfect word of Allah still prevails. Literalism is the dominant understanding of the Quran in the Islamic world. And so when the Quran says, kill them wherever you find them, fight until persecution is no more, and religion is all for Allah, and passages of that kind, there are many Muslims around the world who consider that to be an instruction for them that is to be taken at face value and applied in the modern age.
Can you give me an idea of what percentage of people who are practicing Muslims, you might want to know, who go to a mosque and pray, are radical Islamists? I mean, what are we talking about here?
It depends on what you mean by radical Islamists. If you mean people who are going to do violence against unbelievers, then the percentage is very small. But you're talking about such vast numbers in the first place that even a small percentage is a considerable number of people. For example, if we take the generally accepted fact or generally accepted statistic that there are 1.2 to 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. If we say 1% of them is radical in terms of being inclined toward and willing to commit violence, then that's still a million some people, or well over that. And so that's a very large number of people who could do mayhem in the world. The even worse is the fact that because this is mainstream teaching in Islam, and all the sects of Islam and all the schools of jurisprudence teach the necessity to wage war against unbelievers and subjugate them, even the vast majority of those who will never take up arms, never kill anyone, never blow anything up, they don't have any problem with it being done. And that's why we do not see, and have never seen, large-scale protests of Muslims against jihad terrorism. They're not against it. That's why when we have groups like Muslims Against Terrorism, that was a group in the United States about 15 years ago, and similar groups, and they hold rallies, they get 50 to 100 people as a rule. And most of them are non-Muslims. The Muslims don't go because even if they're not willing to commit jihad violence themselves, they're certainly not going to say that jihad violence is wrong. They know that according to Islamic teaching, it's not wrong.
So there is Islam and there is Muslims. So how many Muslims do you estimate in the world support, I mean, really take seriously the imperative to make Islam to let it rule over the world, to let it rule the world? How many Muslims in the world take that seriously? Because I would like to define them as Islamists, whether they're violent or non-violent.
We have to once again define the situation further. The percentage of devout and knowledgeable Muslims who believe that Islam should dominate and rule the world is about 100%. However, what is the percent of devout and knowledgeable Muslims among Muslims worldwide? There's no way for me to estimate, but it's drastically lower than 100% for two primary reasons. One is the fact that Islam is an Arabic religion. You have to pray in Arabic, you have to read the Quran in Arabic, and it is entirely oriented toward being Arab. Now, most Muslims in the world today are not Arab. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia in terms of population. Indonesia is not Arab. The second largest Muslim population in the world today is in Pakistan, also not Arab. The third is in India, not Arab. Iran, Afghanistan, not Arab. And so what happens? If you go to the madrasas in Pakistan, you will see that young boys are learning to memorize the entire Quran so that they can just recite it at will. However, they are not being taught to understand what it means. That is not the key goal as far as they're concerned. And so there are a great many non-Arab Muslims in the world today who have only the vaguest idea of what Islam teaches, because they rely for what they know of Islam on their teachers, the Muslim clerics in their mosque or school or both. And those clerics may teach any number of things. They may teach violent jihad, but they may not. They may completely ignore it. And that's one issue. The other is the death penalty for apostasy. Islam teaches that if you leave Islam, then you should be killed. Doesn't mean you will be killed, but Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, is quoted in a very famous hadith. Hadith means report, and these are the reports of Muhammad's words and deeds. He said, whoever changes his religion, kill him. Now that applies only to the Muslims. If you're a Muslim and you leave Islam, then you are to be killed. If you are of another religion and convert, that's not their concern. But whoever changes his religion, kill him, means that there are large, massive numbers of people in the Islamic world who identify outwardly as Muslims, but are not in any functional sense Muslims anymore. And so it's very likely that although they're not going to protest against the jihadis, they're not going to join them either.
Yeah.
And it was a remarkable
Yeah.
thing, just in conclusion on this, it's very important. In Iran, there was a survey last year, and although Iran is officially 99% Muslim, only 40% of the survey respondents identified themselves as Muslims. And it's certainly true. There's massive discontent in Iran with Islam after 40 years of Islamic rule, but they can't declare themselves openly. This was an anonymous survey because they'd be killed.
Yeah, and also I personally know several Muslims who are still praying and fasting and doing several rituals, but who are absolutely for Western values and not for jihad, and are for tolerance, and not only saying so but fighting for it. The point I just want to make is, if you meet an individual Muslim, you cannot tell from being him or her being a Muslim what his or her values exactly are.
Absolutely.
Okay. Also, I know of a study in Europe, 6 European countries, 10 years ago, where at least half of the Muslims living in those Western countries, European countries, still believed, reported that they saw Sharia law, Islamic law, as the highest law, as it should be the law of the land. So that's not saying they would be violently going for that, but that's what they would like to see. So that's just another number. Let's move on to how Islamists, or let's say Islamic supremacists, what makes how they think and what makes them tick. Could you please tell us about the Mecca period and the Medina period of Islam, and what the importance of that is for Islamists or radical Muslims?
According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad lived in Mecca, the place of his birth, for 12 years, and then moved to Medina. This was the Hijra, the emigration, and he lived in Medina for the last 10 years of his life. And thus the period of his acting as a prophet is 22 or 23 years. Now, that is roughly also the division of the Quran. It's not a division like in the Christian Bible between the Old Testament and the New Testament, where you have one and then the other. You have a chapter of the Quran and it'll say revealed at Mecca, and then the next one will say revealed at Medina, and then another from Mecca could come. They're all mixed up together. Generally in Qurans, they are labeled as being one or the other. But in the Meccan period, the Muslims, according to Islamic tradition, were a small group and were persecuted by the pagan Arabs of Mecca. And consequently, Muhammad preached tolerance. It was not actually tolerance that he was extending to the non-Muslims. It was tolerance he was asking from the non-Muslims for the Muslims. And then when he moved to Medina, he started to get the revelations about warfare against unbelievers. So generally, the Medinan passages are more violent than the Meccan. Now, this is important for non-Muslims to know today, because in traditional Islamic theology, it is generally agreed that the chronological order of the Quranic passages is what determines their relevance for Muslims today. And so if a passage comes later, it takes precedence over a passage that comes earlier. The violence comes later, so unfortunately, it is the part that is applicable for all time, while the tolerance is only for times and places where, once again, the Muslims are a weak or small group, as Muhammad and the Muslims were in Mecca, and as Muslims have been up to recently in the West.
Let's just take a commercial break for a minute and tell our listeners what years we're talking about, especially in relationship to the fact that the Jews were in Israel much earlier than when Muhammad came out of the desert. And also, would you explain, when we use the word Arab, that you made a point earlier of all those countries that aren't Arabs? So who are the Arabs? So what year and who are the Arabs?
Muhammad, once again, according to Islamic tradition, there are a lot of reasons to question the historical validity of all this, as I've done in several books now, but that's another story. According to the tradition, and what Muslims generally believe, is that Muhammad was born in 570 AD and died in 632, and that in 610 he got a vision of the angel Gabriel, who came down from paradise to begin to give him the Quran. And from the year 610 to the year 632, at various points, Gabriel would reappear to him and give him more of the Quran. And then the Quran was collected together after Muhammad's death, and that's the holy book of Islam today. So that is about 600 years after Christ and several thousand years after the beginnings of Judaism. So this is the last of what are called the Abrahamic religions, although Islam has a supremacist replacement theology, such that the Quran says that Abraham, in chapter 3, verse 67 of the Quran, it says that he was not a Jew or a Christian, he was a Muslim. Now, how could Abraham be a Muslim when he comes so much before Muhammad? The idea in Islam is that the original religion of all the prophets was Islam, and that Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, and then also John the Baptist and Jesus, they all taught Islam. They were all Muslims. But their followers, out of their sinfulness, twisted their teachings to create what we know of today as Judaism and Christianity. As far as your second question goes, the Arabs originally were the people of Arabia. Then in the 7th century AD, they began to invade the surrounding areas, conquered the Middle East and North Africa, and they forcibly Arabized those areas. For example, Egypt. Egypt was, before the Arab conquest in the 7th century, a Christian nation that spoke the Egyptian language, that is the language that we know of today as Coptic. But as not only did the Arabs conquer, but several centuries later, they actually outlawed the Coptic language. So nowadays, the Egyptian Christians who still remain speak Arabic, and so does everyone, virtually everyone in that whole region. But this is the result of conquest and Arabization. Meanwhile, there are other countries that accepted Islam, such as the ones I enumerated earlier, that are not Arab countries.
Let's switch back to our core topic. Phyllis.
What today? Let's not talk about the past.
No,
gonna-
question four. Question
Yeah, I
four,
know.
please.
We're
Yeah.
going to move to the future.
Yeah.
I mean, the present now.
Yeah.
What do Islamists or radical Muslims say today about Jews and coexistence with Jews and other non-Muslims?
There is no coexistence with Jews and other non-Muslims in Islam. It can't be done. This is, once again, I'm talking about Islamic teaching. That doesn't mean that every Muslim is believing or acting upon these things, but these are what the teachings say. That in the first place, the Muslims must wage war against the Jews, the Christians, and other non-Muslims, in order to subjugate them, make them pay a tax, the jizya, and submit to various humiliating and discriminatory regulations that deny them equality of rights in the Islamic society. That is the ideal. Now, that is how the Islamic caliphates always worked in history, but the last caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, the caliphate was abolished in 1924, a few years after the empire itself fell, and there's been no caliph since then. But the idea is that the jihad groups are working to restore the hegemony of Islam, as I explained at the beginning. That would be the restoration of the caliphate, which would mean the restoration of this subjugated status for the Jews and other non-Muslims. And so there's no coexistence. As a matter of fact, it's even worse for the Jews because of a hadith in which Muhammad says that the last hour, that is the day of judgment, the end of the world, the day when everything is, when God reveals himself without equivocation or any disagreement, and he is completely in command, and there's the total victory of Islam, then that will come, that day will only come, Muhammad says, the last hour will not come until Muslims kill Jews. And Jews hide behind trees, and the trees call out, "Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." Now, people like to ridicule this. They think it's absurd in the West, and there is a certain absurdity to the story with the talking trees, and other versions have talking stones and so on. But it's a very real thing that many Muslims take this seriously, think Muhammad really said it. And so they think that they can actually bring on the final victory of Islam at the last day by killing Jews.
Isn't this what Hamas has in its charter?
Yes, exactly. And so they think that when they are killing Jews, they're committing a righteous deed that will help to bring on the final victory of Islam.
And isn't this what the bigger organization, global organization of Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, is believing?
Oh, very much so, yes. This
Okay.
is in the canonical hadith, the reports of Muhammad's words and deeds that Muslims consider, Islamic scholars consider authentic. It would be hard to find a Muslim who would say, "Oh, no, that's not something Muhammad said," because it's in the collections that are considered to be reliable. As a matter of fact, that's what they're called, sahih, reliable.
Yeah. So that means that if we rely on Hamas being able to appease Hamas, that means we would rely on the fact that they would disregard not only their own charter, but an important Islamic source, while they are very religious.
Yes, exactly. Anybody who thinks that they can do business with Hamas, that as non-Muslims make some accord, have some agreement, they're whistling in the dark. They're deluding themselves. Hamas made it very clear in its charter what it wants to do. And it says in the right at the beginning of the charter, is Israel will arise and will continue until Islam obliterates it. Consequently, there is no negotiated settlement. There's no peace. There's no two-state solution. All of that is fantasy on the part of Western negotiators. That Hamas might agree to some deal with the West because they think that it will weaken Israel and help them attain their ultimate goal. But there will never be an agreement that would lead Hamas to set aside that ultimate goal.
And there are also Jewish organizations and Christian churches that in the West, in America and Europe, have these partnerships and interfaith dialogues with Islamist organizations that are allied with the Muslim Brotherhood or part of it, or were started by the Muslim Brotherhood. We also have in universities the Students for Justice in Palestine. Do they believe these same tenets?
Very much so. Students for Justice in Palestine, in particular, is an extraordinarily virulent, violent group that is menacing Jewish students and supporters of Israel on campuses all over the United States at this point. And they were founded by people and groups with Muslim Brotherhood links. The Muslim Brotherhood is dedicated in its own words, according to a captured internal document, to eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house. Now it's a very effective way to do that, to make people think that these groups are working for human rights and for the equality or justice for the Palestinians, when actually they are genocidal, frankly genocidal in intent.
Okay, so those partnerships in the West between Jewish organizations and Muslim Brotherhood organizations is something we, I think, should dive into in another episode. Let's go back to what's going on right now with the war in Israel. In pro-Palestinian protests around the world that were mostly led by Islamists like Students for Justice in Palestine, we heard the chants "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and "Khaybar, Khaybar, Ya Yahud." What do these chants mean?
From the river to the sea means that Israel must be destroyed utterly. I think a lot of the people who are chanting that lately, particularly non-Muslims, have no idea that that's what it means. And actually, there've been some interesting videos and such of people asking which river, which sea, and they don't have any idea. But the river in question is the Jordan, and the sea is the Mediterranean. Israel is between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea in its entirety. And so from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, means Israel must be destroyed. Now, in light of the fact that numerous Palestinian Arab leaders, including Mahmoud Abbas of the supposedly moderate Palestinian Authority, have made it abundantly clear that there will be not a single Jew allowed to live in the future Palestinian state, this is even more of a genocidal chant. Because where are they going to go? There's 7 million Jews in Israel. If they're going to be driven out entirely of that land, you're going to have millions of people killed. But that seems to be actually something that's just fine with those who are propagating this phrase. After all, they're the ones who believe that the last hour will not come until Muslims kill Jews. So Khaybar Ya Yahud just underscores that even more strongly. Khaybar was and is actually an oasis in northern Arabia. And Muhammad, when he moved to Medina in the Hijra, he found 3 Jewish tribes there. He exiled 2 of them immediately, and he made an alliance with them, but then he turned on them and demanded they accept Islam. They refused. He exiled them. Then the 3rd was in the city of Medina with him during the siege, when the pagan Arabs came from Mecca to lay siege to Medina. And he thought that the Jews in Medina had betrayed him. So he beheaded between 600 and 900 of the men, and he exiled the women and children. And all of these exiles from the 3 tribes went to Khaybar. Then later he showed up at Khaybar and massacred them there. And on his deathbed, he said, "Let there be no Jews or Christians in Arabia." And even to this day, the government of Saudi Arabia does not allow the practice of any religion but Islam. And so if you're Christian and you come into Saudi Arabia, don't expect to be able to practice your religion. It's forbidden. In any case, the Khaybar massacre became the basis for this chant. Khaybar Ya Yahud, Jaish Muhammad Sayaud. Khaybar, O Jews, the army of Muhammad will return.
So that's what we hear in protests, pro-Palestinian protests in
All over
America and in Europe,
and it's
all
a
over the
threat
globe.
saying, we're going to massacre you again.
Right.
Okay.
And it's a genocidal threat.
Yes.
Yes.
People have said, oh, try to justify from the river to the sea isn't a genocidal threat, but Khaybar is definitely one.
Exactly.
Well, yeah. And we heard the horrible story of Hamas terrorists killing people in the kibbutzim in Israel on October 7, young guys doing that, and then calling their parents in Gaza and being exhilarated about what they just did and like bragging about it to their parents. Does that have any connection to their religion and the way they interpret it?
Yes.
Sorry?
Absolutely, yes. There have been Hamas leaders who have said, actually prayed to Allah, "You have made killing Jews an act of worship," which connects to the hadith that the last hour will not come until Muslims kill Jews. That makes killing Jews a sacred act that will hasten the final judgment and the victory of Islam. And so there was even a music video of a band in Gaza some years ago that said the same thing, that killing Jews is worship of Allah. And in the West, there's no understanding of this. And people generally think that everyone has the same value system the world over. But the boy who called his parents and said, "I've killed 10 Jews," he doesn't have the value system of the West, and he has contempt for the idea that all human beings have dignity before God and that we should respect human life. He has no idea of that at all. He thinks these people are the most vile of created beings, that they are like cattle, that they are like animals. That's what the Quran calls unbelievers, that the Jews are the enemies of Islam, of Allah, and the worst enemies of the Muslims, as the Quran also says. And so he thinks he's done a wonderful thing by killing them.
So what we should understand is that Islamists believe that what is written in the Quran and the example that and that the life and words of Prophet Muhammad are leading in what they have to believe and to do. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. What Muhammad says, see, Muhammad is called the excellent example in the Quran. That's chapter 33, verse 21. Very important statement because there's no qualification on it. He's the excellent example in everything he says and does. And so the highest thing that a Muslim can do is imitate Muhammad. So if Muhammad says that it's a blessed thing to kill Jews, then there's no questioning that. He could not be wrong. And so that means that he's given his approval to behaving monstrously and thinking that one is serving God in doing so.
I have a question. Why is this so unknown to Western culture? So many people have no idea that this is what radical Islamists believe in and what a threat it is to our democracies.
Islamists are radical.
Yes, I know.
Okay.
My point is saying, why does that information not get out to the West?
Well, you know, there's been a concerted effort to conceal it. And it actually goes back before 9/11, but it really picked up in energy after 9/11. Right after 9/11, on September 17th, 2001, the President of the United States, George Bush, went to a mosque and he said, Islam is peace. And he was standing in front of Nihad Awad, the founder, co-founder, and executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Nihad Awad is one of the foremost Muslim leaders in the United States, but he's also said openly that he supports Hamas. Bush was also standing in front of Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who is now in prison for financing al-Qaeda. And so my point is, he thought he was standing with moderate Muslims, but he was not. And he said Islam is peace, which it is not. And he hamstrung and deformed the ability of the United States government by saying that to deal honestly with the ideological roots of the threat. The establishment media, meanwhile, was very skillfully played by groups such as the Council on American Islamic Relations and others, into thinking that it was racist or Islamophobic to speak about the Islamic derivations of jihad violence. And so people now have been misled, actively misled for 20 years. They have no idea, because the people who spoke the truth about these things, meanwhile, were demonized, stigmatized, marginalized, and silenced. And people were told, oh, they're terrible, they're bigoted, they're racist, they're Islamophobic. Don't listen to them. Listen to the people who are telling you Islam is peace and tolerance and just like any other belief system. And this is the fruit of it now, that nowadays people think Islamophobia, which is a made-up word that doesn't have any actual substance at all, is a big problem. And they don't know that jihad terrorism is a big problem, a much bigger problem, in fact.
So what can we do about it? How do we get this?
Wait. What strategic goals, Robert, do Islamist groups like Hamas achieve in a ceasefire? We're talking about ceasefires all the time. There's protests for it. The American government, I think, even wants a ceasefire. What strategic goals do Islamist groups like Hamas achieve in a ceasefire?
It's very important to note that here again, Islam gives us the answer. And Islam is the one thing that all the Western negotiators, politicians, analysts of this conflict always ignore. And yet it always elucidates what's going on. In Islam, if you are a Muslim entity and you're fighting against a non-Muslim entity, you do not ask for a truce except under two circumstances. One, if the enemy is going to become Muslim, that's not in play here. And two, if you are losing and you need time to gather strength to fight again more effectively. And so Hamas wants a ceasefire to fight again more effectively, to gather its strength instead of being completely obliterated by Israel at this point. And the Western governments don't know this or care about it. And so they're saying, yes, you should give us a humanitarian ceasefire and all that. But the goal really for Hamas is to regroup, to fight again.
Okay, that's something to keep in mind. So, which mistakes should Israel and Jews elsewhere avoid in dealing with Islamists? And connecting with Phyllis' question of a few minutes ago, what is it we should do against Islamism?
Well, you know, a lot of Jews in the West are leftists, and they should realize that their leftist friends, such as those calling for a ceasefire, are not really their friends, and that they're not acting in the best interests of Israel or of Jews worldwide. And there needs to be a massive reevaluation in the Jewish community of the support for the left, because the left is arrayed against all their interests. So the biggest problem that we have today is the alliance between the left and the jihad. And we see that with the Biden administration giving $100 million to Gaza after October 7th and $10 billion to Iran after October 7th, even though Iran is funding Hamas. And there doesn't seem to be any recognition of that in general among supporters of Israel. That needs to change.
And what else what should Israel avoid in dealing with Islamists, and what should we as individuals in the West avoid in dealing with Islamists?
In both cases, avoid trusting them, avoid believing them. Look at the larger picture. For example, on October 8th, the day after the massacre in Israel, a senior Hamas leader went on Russia Today television and boasted about how Hamas had fooled the Israeli authorities, and that enabled the October 7th massacre. And he said, we made them think that we were not interested in waging jihad against Israel. We were trying to govern Gaza, and that was the focus of our activities. And so the Israelis actually withdrew soldiers from the border of Gaza and moved them to the West Bank. If they had understood the hadith, another hadith in which Muhammad says, war is deceit. You shouldn't lie to anybody except a husband can lie to the wife to keep peace in the marriage, and you can lie in wartime. War is deceit. War is deceit is something the Israelis did not take into account, and the Western politicians never take into account, that they might be being lied to by Hamas and by these Palestinian leaders who believe that their prophet told them that deceiving the unbelievers was an important weapon in wartime. And so if they had not believed Hamas when they said, oh, we're busy with Gaza and we're not going to be bothering you, then maybe that massacre would not have happened on October 7th.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Phyllis?
We're coming to the end. I'd like to give you one last chance, but I'd like to also say one simple thing that Evelyn and I have been talking about. I got a notice, I won't say which Jewish organization is having a Muslim Jewish evening. And I asked Evelyn about the group's, funding and stuff. And since Evelyn knows this stuff, she did the research, and we discovered that if you, go deep enough, you discover that this group really has ties to Muslim Brotherhood. So when we say we can't trust them, we need to do due diligence. We can't just say when a group comes to us and we're a Jewish organization, oh, we want to have an evening of Muslim Jewish whatever. Do your research. It's not that hard, thanks to the internet, before you give a platform to groups that really want to kill you. Okay, that was my commercial break. Do you have any last words before we end?
Well, I couldn't agree more with that. And just in closing, remember that one of the key theorists of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb, he said, yes, we should build bridges with the infidels, but we have to remember that's a one-way bridge. It's a bridge to Islam to get them to become Muslim. It is not a mutual dialogue or any focus for Muslims to convert to other religions. Now, all over the world today, all over the West, you see Muslims, they have bridges. They are building bridges. Even Georgetown University has the Bridge Initiative out of the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And the bridges, people don't understand that that's not a place where two groups meet in the middle and shake hands and become friends. It is a one-way bridge, as Qutb said. And these Jewish groups need to understand that. This is all designed to get you to be complacent about Islam and about the jihad threat, or even ultimately to convert you to Islam. It is not a matter of mutuality, mutual respect, or dialogue.
Thank you. I hope everyone listening to this understands that and acts accordingly. This has been such an informative and compelling talk. Thank you, Robert, so much for coming on our show. Thank our listeners for listening. For those of you who want to know more about Evelyn, myself, and our activities, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And as we end every show, we say, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.